This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 203 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. I'm going to keep my intro short and sweet today because I give a bit of an intro at the beginning of the episode, but I recorded this Q&A session for the members of the School of Clinical Leadership because there were some questions that came up about how are we supposed to support students who need constant prompting? How do we fade prompting? And how do we support parents at home? So just some specific implementation questions. So I wanted to share this as an episode because I also get a lot of questions on my free webinar called How to Be Evidence-Based and Neurodiversity Affirming by Supporting Executive Functioning. So I will link to both the School of Clinical Leadership and the free training, as well as the time tracking journal, which is something that I mentioned in this episode. So definitely check the show notes for all the links to those resources, as well as a previous episode that I mentioned where I talk about front loading for social situations. So the specific questions that I answer in this episode are: what is front loading and why is it useful for students experiencing executive dysfunction and anxiety? When is it best to use structured, explicit instruction? And when is it best to let students figure things out on their own? How do you help students who won't complete work unless they have an adult sitting next to them? And how do we provide enough support for students who need explicit instruction, but not so much that we're making them prompt dependent? What can school staff do if parents aren't setting boundaries with kids at home, especially around things like bedtime, morning routines, and access to screens? And how can we support parents who are struggling with those tasks, especially getting kids out the door in the morning? So, like I said, if you're interested in the School of Clinical Leadership, you can check it out at drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. There is lots more in that program that walks through some specific strategies, as well as how you can create a strategic plan for your school team to get this support in place, both in your direct therapy sessions, as well as in some of the classrooms, and really just getting your entire multidisciplinary team on board. Now, please enjoy this episode where I talk about front loading and explicit instruction. Hey everybody, today I wanted to go through some frequently asked questions that are coming up in the members area of the School of Clinical Leadership program. So this is obviously going to be available for program members, but I wanted to make this Q&A available to other people because these are questions that also come up on my free webinar that kind of gives the overview of what's in the School of Clinical Leadership. So I'm going to get started here and just go through some of the most common questions that I get on both the webinar, which is really people who are interested in learning about executive functioning, whether it be for their students, for themselves, or whether it be for their kids. And also just some of the questions that are coming up for the people who have invested in the School of Clinical Leadership program and are really working on developing their own programming for their direct intervention as it pertains to executive functioning, and also trying to get some of that programming in place in their school buildings and possibly in their private practice. So I'm going to go through a couple things. The top questions that I get that I wanted to cover today are, number one, what is front loading? Because I use that term frequently and I get asked about it frequently. Just what is it and how does it apply to this situation? I also get questions about how you might fade prompting. And I think there's a lot of confusion about this because in my free webinar, I do say things like, just that you can't reward or punish a child into doing skills that they don't have. But at the same time, we don't want to be constantly prompting kids and acting as their executive functioning. And so I think people struggle to figure out what's the balance in between that, because on one end, we don't want to just keep things completely unstructured. We know that many students need explicit instruction in things like language and executive functioning. We need to directly teach these skills in order for students with neurodevelopmental differences to learn a lot of these skills, especially if we know that they're struggling. But at the same time, we know that if we're constantly prompting and pulling information out of them or reminding them what step they need to do next and essentially solving all their problems for them, they're not ever going to develop those skills. So I wanted to tease out some examples and walk through a framework that you can use to think about this, and then also address some frequently asked questions that come up as it pertains to that scaffolding and fading prompting. Just kind of talking through some examples that might come up in the home setting because you might be somebody who is coaching parents, and then also how it might present in a school situation, and then talk about how we can support both parents and teachers who are working through those types of situations. So I'll start off by giving the definition of front loading as I understand it and the way that I use it, because there's many different ways. Really, front loading is doing the work up front. So, for example, I used to use the term front loading when I was in college because when I had a big paper due at the end of the semester, what I liked to do was front load and get a lot of it done at the beginning and give myself a due date well before it was actually due, because I liked to play around with the draft, and it would cause me a lot of anxiety to wait till the last minute. And that would really stress me out. So what I had to do was make a deadline and plan and prepare up front. So again, front load, I would load the work up front in order to be more prepared. Now, many other people don't work that way. They really need to feel that deadline looming. And so they may wait way longer. But what I liked to do was think about how I could prepare up front for a situation that was coming up in the future. Now, that's one way that you might hear the word front loading used. And I would say the concept of how you might use front loading in terms of working on executive functioning with children and with young adults is similar, but I'm going to clarify how it might be a little bit different depending on the context. So again, it's really about planning and preparing. So what we're doing when we're front loading is your kids that you're supporting have situations that are happening in their lives. So they might have specific events that are coming up. And what we want to do is do something with them, have a planning session with them to give them information, allow them to run through the task and practice, teach them skills, and give them what they need in order to increase their chances of being successful in whatever the situation is that's coming up, which is also going to help manage their anxiety. So again, there's a big relationship between executive dysfunction and anxiety. Of course, anxiety can exist for other reasons, but a lot of times executive dysfunction and not feeling prepared causes anxiety. So that can be really powerful if we are working with students to plan and prepare and give them information so they know what's coming and help kind of visualize and paint that picture for them using a number of different methods. And that does really help with anxiety because a lot of times people feel anxious because they're not prepared. Kind of going back to why I used to front load for myself. So I don't have ADHD, but I do have some anxiety about unknowns. And I used to, even though my anxiety wasn't stemming from executive dysfunction, what I would use is my executive functioning skills to help manage my own anxiety by preparing up front, knowing that I had the work done, knowing that I had blocked out time for what if something goes wrong? What if this draft that I'm working on takes me longer? What if I get sick and I'm not able to work on it when I thought I was going to work on it? And I would think about all those different kinds of things. And if I waited till, closer to the deadline, I would get stressed out and it would cause me a lot of anxiety. So using that method of planning and preparing and using my own executive functioning skills, I would manage my anxiety. So going back to why we might do it for students. So some students might not necessarily be thinking like I was. Maybe they're not engaging their executive functioning skills because they're not developed yet. And in that situation, the anxiety might come later for them. It might come in the when they're in that situation or when that deadline is more, when they're closer to that deadline because they're realizing, oh my gosh, I'm not prepared and I haven't prepared up until this point. And so within that situation, it causes them anxiety because it feels, again, they don't necessarily feel prepared. And then maybe the situation might not go as well because they didn't prepare. Whereas, for me, I had that anxiety well before. So it was different, but in either situation, front loading is a very effective tool for managing that anxiety, whether it's because we need to teach those executive functioning skills or whether it's because your executive functioning is already going and you're thinking about all the potential things that could go wrong, which is what I tend to do. I'm kind of on the polar opposite of that end. So again, front loading is about planning and preparing. So let me give you a couple specific contexts. So the way that I often teach my time journal strategy to therapists and clinicians that are working in the schools is that I give a writing task as an example of a situation where a school clinician, for example, could front load and prepare their student for a writing assignment that might have to be done in their class. And this might be something that's coming up, that's a one-time thing that we know is coming, or it might be something like maybe it's an ongoing thing that happens every week and the student is struggling and we need to prepare for that ongoing thing. So at a very high level, how that would look in a school situation is that maybe in that smaller group, what you're doing is that you're taking the student aside and you're practicing how they might do research and take notes for writing and go through that preparation process, which is overwhelming and might be difficult for students to learn in that bigger class. So you're front loading by teaching those skills up front in a smaller group where you can give students attention. You might be modeling how students can watch the clock and kind of map out how they're going to spend their time. So you might have an analog clock and you might be shading in different parts and say, okay, for this 15 minutes, we're going to be doing some research and then we're going to be doing our outline and kind of map out time and model how students might be able to look back at that clock and remind them to be checking for the time. We might model self-talk and encourage students to ask themselves questions. So we might be modeling and practicing that in this smaller group because that's something that we'd want students to take over to the classroom. We might be talking about the situation that's coming up. Okay, we've practiced this strategy and we've walked through how you would do this research paper when you go to class. Let's think about how that's going to look when we go into the classroom. So that might be another way that you could front load and how front loading could look. And that might be a series of sessions. That might be something that you do in your therapy session. If you're a special ed teacher or an SLP or other support personnel, reading specialist, or really anybody who's supporting students, this could be a way that you front load for writing. And then maybe you're collaborating with the teacher and you're talking about what you're doing in your small group and then how we're going to transfer that over to the large group to help students remember to retrieve the strategies. Maybe you've talked to the teacher about what you've done in your small group, and then the teacher might have some, they might be modeling self-talk in the classroom, or they might have some different ways that they're going to talk with students about, reminding them to use their strategies and watch the clock and think about how to ask themselves questions. So maybe you've already talked to the teacher about that, and that's how you might collaborate and front load for a situation that's coming up. I've also used this strategy for preparing students for recess in a previous podcast episode where I talk about executive functioning paradigm shifts for school teams. I talked about an example of how we might front load for a student who is going outside to recess and needs some support interacting with peers during an unstructured time. And so that's an example for a younger student, but you may have some other situations for older students, whether it's the lunchroom or maybe it's some other unstructured passing period, or maybe it's a class in school where you've got to do a lot of unstructured group work. Maybe it's an extracurricular activity that they're doing, or it could even be like a vocational setting for an older student. So number of different ways you can front load, but what it really is planning, preparing, teaching skills, giving information, and this can be kind of an ongoing process. So there's kind of the front loading, going and doing the real life task in the less structured situation to give some application, and then some reviewing. And so ideally, we want to have a mix of all of those things when we're working on executive functioning, because we want to make sure that we're not going too far in either direction. I've heard people who are like, you know what, the best way for people to learn is just to kind of let them figure it out, which of course we need to give kids the opportunity to figure it out. But many students, if they don't have those skills, then it's going to be really frustrating for them to just figure it out. So we do need to give them some explicit instruction. And that's what those front loading sessions can be for. That's where you can start to teach some of those strategies. But then we don't stop there. We don't stop with that structured setting. We give the practice in the structured setting, and then we always have a method for, all right, how are we going to create a situation for the student to actually apply those skills? These things need to work together, and that's how we can avoid going too far in one direction or the other, is that we have this multiple models that we're using. So with front loading, it doesn't have to be a formal therapy session. It can be something really quick, like maybe just a quick conversation that a teacher is having with the student. Like as you're kind of walking through class, it can just be a quick reminder. And that might be something that you're able to do eventually when maybe your student has had some practice with these skills in a smaller group. Maybe it can be just a really quick conversation. Like maybe the teaching assistant just has a really quick check-in with some students before you start the assignment in class or before you walk out to the lunchroom or whatever it is. So again, the concept of front loading can be used in many different ways, but we want to think about it as giving our students a chance to prepare. One other thing that it can be really powerful is if we are doing role play strategically. Again, remember that the role play is not the be all end all. So I've seen people use role play as a strategy where they just role play a situation and it's like a social situation in their therapy session, and then they just leave it and then they don't take it a step further and actually apply it to real life. But when you use role play in the context of front loading, it actually can be really helpful. Adults do this all the time. For example, I was interviewing for a job in the last couple of years. And so what did I do before I interviewed? Well, I had a mock interview. I did a practice run with somebody. What do you do before you give a big presentation? Well, you might present to some peers and they give you feedback. So, what are you going to do if you have to, I guess we said the presentation, we said the interview, maybe even if you have to have a difficult conversation. Another example that I could give is that social workers and other clinicians sometimes have to do a technique called motivational interviewing with clients. It's a method that they can use to work through different types of distorted thinking and make some different mindset shifts. And it can be really difficult to learn how to do that when you're on the spot with somebody. It's an emotional situation. So the training for motivational interviewing usually means doing practice runs with other people. So for example, there might be one person over here who's pretending to be the client and is objecting to what they're saying. And then the other person is practicing. And then there's people giving them feedback. So that's another way that we could front load in a structured situation, do a mock run, a mock conversation, even if it's something that's not academic. You can do a test run there to practice your skills. And then, of course, you want to go and have real experiences, but you do those mock runs and those dress rehearsals or role plays to give you some practice before you do the real thing. And it does help to ease anxiety. It helps build skills, and it can be an important part of the process. Another example of what we can do for kids, I know that sometimes if kids are going to go to a different place that they've never gone to before, like maybe they have their first soccer game, like it could be good to take them to the soccer field beforehand and let them see what the soccer field looks like and kind of talk through what it's actually going to look like. That can be really powerful because if students are having a difficult time visualizing the future, if you actually go there and let them see what it's like, that's an opportunity to create that visualization. And then when you're back home, you can kind of talk back and, work on episodic memory and go back to, all right, remember what we saw when we went to the soccer field. So those are all kinds of ways that we can front load. Okay, so that kind of outlines how we want to think about that scaffolding. But one other framework I wanted to mention that can help you tease out how to avoid going too far in one direction or the other. So again, way unstructured and overwhelming because we haven't taught the skills versus way on the other side where we're constantly prompting. We want to make sure that we offer this continuum and kind of help students along that continuum so that we are giving them structure when it's appropriate, but then we're also giving them the chance to apply those skills. So a framework that is really helpful in teasing this out and understanding how to actually teach these skills is the Explicit Instruction Framework by Archer and Hughes. I can link to that resource. So this is something that is used in classrooms, but it can absolutely be applied to community-based and home settings as well, and non-academic tasks. So the framework has 3 steps. There's the informal names of the steps are I do, we do, you do. But the formal steps are called modeling, guided practice, and independent practice. So modeling is I do, guided practice is we do, and then independent practice is you do. So in the modeling phase, what that looks like is that the adult or the person teaching the skill is just simply modeling the skill, and the person learning is watching. Guided practice is when you're doing it together and it's kind of a collaborative approach. So maybe, if you're working on a child with, like, let's say that you're working on making breakfast, maybe you're setting some things out for them and they're doing some of the steps. So you're doing a little bit of it, but they're doing some things too, or maybe you do one step and they do the other step. So that can be a little bit flexible with how you do that. But again, they're actively doing some things, but you're doing some things as well. And so you're kind of there if you need to jump in, and you're gradually trying to fade yourself out of that, where you might, as you go through that guided practice, be allowing them to do some planning and get things set up. And then if you see they're getting stuck, you might jump in and try to support and then kind of fade back, with the eventual goal of independent practice, where you can just say, okay, like, I'm going to hang out over here and you go and do your writing assignment or your homework, or, make yourself breakfast, and you're just kind of there. You're maybe aware of what's going on, but you're not really doing anything actively. You're allowing them to do it independently. And maybe you're monitoring, you're kind of in the vicinity and you know that they're practicing so that you can be aware that they actually did the practice, but you're allowing them to do it on their own. So that's how it's laid out. And that's what you want to think about these, or that's how you want to think about this. So an example of how this could look if you were doing the writing assignment is that your front loading would be where you can start this process. Now, this gets it's a little bit confusing because we're layering one framework on to another. The way that I like to explain the bigger picture or the bird's eye view of the framework is that we want to think about priming / front loading. So that beginning phase where we're teaching and preparing, then we want to have real life practice, and then we want to have that review and evaluation. So these are like the big picture chunks, but then within the context of those things, you can layer this explicit instruction framework. So for example, I might be front loading, And then within my front loading session, I might be using this explicit instruction framework and be kind of going back and forth between I do, we do, you do in my front loading session. So, and then maybe a teacher in the real life practice understands this explicit instruction framework, and maybe they might be able to, in this situation, when the student is in their classroom, kind of jump in and say, oh, hey, I've got to model a little bit here, and then I've got to kind of back up. And in that classroom, that overall situation is the real life practice. It's less structured, but the teacher could, in theory, jump in and do some modeling, do some guided practice, or maybe they could make sure that there was a teaching assistant that could kind of jump in. So that's how that could look. And then in the review phase, that could be in the classroom, it could be in the therapy room where you're kind of talking about what happened. Again, you can kind of go back and have a discussion about what happened in the past and debrief and what could we have done better. And then you might cycle back around to actually practicing the skill. So again, within that session, you might still be kind of going between those phases of modeling, guided practice, independent practice. So we kind of insert that explicit instruction and framework in to these bigger buckets that we have within our instructional framework or within our intervention framework. So all that being said, how could this look? How would this look if you were wanting to support a student in doing some kind of a writing assignment? Let's use that example because that is a more of an academic type of task, but you could absolutely apply this to cleaning your room or brushing your teeth or making a meal. So in the modeling phase, what you can do is you might be just walking through and explaining the steps to the task. And while you're doing that, while you're talking about how you might be doing your research and taking your notes to prepare for this writing assignment, you can also be modeling, you know what? I think this is going to take me about 10 minutes and I want to plan out, how I'm going to spend this next 30 minutes. So I think I'm going to just shade, in about 15 minutes on this clock here. And this is going to be the time. I'm going to watch the time as I'm taking my notes and just, make sure and just pay attention to how long this is taking me to see if I'm on track. And then maybe this next 15 minutes here is when I'm going to be wanting to take my notes and transfer them over to my graphic organizer. And that's just an example. Those time periods obviously can be adjusted, but I might even say something like, well, and while I'm in the activity, maybe I realize, my notes are going to take longer than I thought. I might need to adjust my timeline and maybe we're not going to get to the graphic organizer today. Maybe I should adjust my plan for how long this assignment's going to take me because I've been working on taking notes for 15 minutes and it's taking me longer than I thought. So I might need to adjust my timeline. So while you're doing the activity, you can be explaining out loud and modeling your self-talk out loud so students understand how you're solving problems and asking yourself questions. And you may even you're explicit to the extent of saying, I am going to be talking to myself in my head and out loud to show you how you might be asking yourself questions in this situation. So that's how the modeling can look. And of course, depending on what the task is, you could be modeling over multiple sessions, or you might have a mini task where you want to model the whole thing within your session. So that's what I mean by modeling. Then when we get to guided practice, let's say that you have a writing assignment, here is where it gets where that scaffolding comes in, where you want to be really mindful of the type of language that you're using in order to really fade yourself out of the process as much as possible. And again, this could be something that is done in a structured situation in your therapy room, or this can be something that a teacher is also doing in the classroom. You don't necessarily have to be rigid with, for example, let's say that I was in my therapy room and I was working with my students on the note-taking process of writing. And then later on in the day, the student is going to do a writing assignment in class. Well, the teacher doesn't have to be like, well, the SLP didn't get through the whole process in her therapy session, so I'm not going to teach my writing lesson. No, the teacher can still go on with their writing lesson and kind of go on to a task and allow the student to try it, knowing that maybe not all the skills are there. And maybe this process might get better for the student as you move along. So just saying there that there is some flexibility within this process. So back to what I was saying about guided practice and how this might look. So here is where people tend to get stuck, because a lot of times people will say to me on my webinar, for example, well, what if I can't make them do the writing assignment? Or what if they're not doing it? I can't, I have a whole class to run. I can't sit there with this student and be making sure that they're going through step by step, et cetera. Well, the thing is that you don't have to. You don't have to be fixated on this end goal and create a false sense of urgency. And that's really important in this guided practice phase. The whole purpose of using something like the time journal, where we're teaching kids to plan and predict and prepare and then do and evaluate while they're doing and then finish and then evaluate back, is that we want to teach them the skills of the preparation, the doing, and the evaluation. And so we also, within the context of teaching writing, also want to build writing skills, but we don't want to be so fixated on teaching writing skills that we think it's the end of the world if the student doesn't finish this 5-paragraph essay in X amount of time. We want to do both of those things, but we don't want to be so fixated on this end goal that we stress out and create this false sense of urgency around the student having to complete a writing assignment in a certain length of time, to the extent that we forget about building the skills that are going to eventually enable them to do that 5-paragraph essay or whatever it is. So when teachers say to me, well, you know what, I can't make him do it. He's not going to finish the assignment in class and I have 25 other students. That's okay. It might be okay that they don't finish. What you're doing is you're providing the opportunity and the support and the scaffolding and allowing the student the autonomy and the choice. And yes, there might be a consequence for them just in life for completing whatever, making whatever choice that they did. And obviously we've got to be mindful of, is it a can't do or won't do? But you don't have to make them do it. You don't have to be sitting there with students and hovering over them. The guided practice phase is really where we try to get ourselves out of it. So how do we do that? Well, at the beginning of guided practice, again, if you're doing the writing assignment, it might be, okay, you've watched me take some notes and then put it into the graphic organizer and then, move it into this, these 5 paragraphs or whatever it is. And then we're going to have the student do some of it. This is the tricky part. I won't lie and say that it isn't, but what we want to do is, again, we allow the student to get started. If it's reading a paragraph and taking some notes and, maybe they sit there and don't want to get started, and some things that we can say in that particular situation are, where does your attention need to be? What do we need to do in order to get ready? So you might model those questions, or maybe you have worked with them on creating some type of a visual strategy or something that they can use to remind themselves to ask them questions. You might even just say, where can you look to figure out what you should be doing right now? So we want to make sure that we chunk those different pieces and those different steps so that we're giving students a manageable amount. But that's really the most that we can do there, is that we give them the manageable amount, give them that opportunity to do the skill. So maybe it's you want them to take a couple notes from a paragraph, and you might say something like, allow them to read it, and maybe you let them read it. You give them a certain length of time, and it's, you give them the length of time to read it, and then you allow them to make that choice. And maybe you've got something planned, and we've got a certain length of time planned for the activity, and maybe they have to get through the thing that they don't like to do before they can get to something that they want to do. So it could be something structured like that. But again, you're just kind of allowing them to do the task. Now, the way that we kind of go back and forth between the modeling and the guided practice is that we may just allow the student to read the task or do whatever it is that they're saying. And then if you can see that they're struggling, what you can do is use some kind of a probing question, so a reflective question, such as where can you look for information? What questions can you be asking yourself? You might make a declarative statement here and say something like, I see your strategies listed there on the table there, and just make a comment about something in the room that might guide them to looking for something. You might even make a comment about, I see, I see that the clock is showing that it's 1:15 right now. And so that means we've got about 15 minutes left to do the activity in order for us to do whatever the preferred activity is. And you might have students that just don't want to do it, and they might sit there and struggle. And that just means you just say, okay, the choice that you made is that we'll come back to it next time. And then you come back to the activity in the next session. So, but that could be one way that you can handle it, where it is, again, you're giving the student the choice. And if they choose to not do the task, they just come back to it. And you might realize in that particular situation, and this is where we've got to have that clinical judgment. It can be difficult to figure out, is it that they just are getting frustrated because they don't want to do it and it's something that is hard for them? Or is it something where, maybe you gave them something that is too difficult? And here's where maybe you can adjust and you can give them something that's less difficult. So, and then another thing that you can try, which again, you kind of have to go back and forth between allowing the student versus having them do it on their own, is that you might, let's say that a student struggled the entire session and they didn't get through it. You might say, okay, that thing that we struggled with before, I'm going to show you how I would do it. And maybe you model the task for them and you do the whole task and they see you do it. And then you say, okay, now it's your turn. And you might have them do the entire task that you just modeled for them. That could be a form of scaffolding. And that could be a way that you could help students through that activity that was difficult for them. So with that example, let's say that you want them to take notes on something. So because they're going to eventually transfer it over to something that's a writing assignment. Let's say that you gave them a paragraph and they sat there and struggled the entire time through your session. And then you say, okay, well, all right, that's fine. This was, and again, you don't have to make it a big deal. Just say, all right, it's normal for something to be hard. The first time we try it, we're learning new skills and just kind of encourage the fact that maybe they tried or they were resilient, and really focusing on if they did something positive there, if they showed effort. So praising that. But then when you come back to it, maybe you take the same paragraph and you model how you might take notes. And then you come back to it again, and maybe you take away your model, and then you allow the student to do it after you just modeled it for them. So they're still doing the task, but you gave them the model, and that could be their scaffolding. So if this was a functional task that you were doing at home, let's say that they're downstairs and we're encouraging them to make breakfast, and they sat there and they were really frustrated. And the next day you do it, you say, okay, I'm going to let you watch me do it. You do it for yourself and you say, all right, you just watched me do it. Now you're going to do it on your own. And so again, the modeling could be a way that you provide that scaffolding during guided practice. So it's you do it, you show them how to do it, and then they immediately do it after. So that could be another way that you can scaffold. Now, in the context of speech pathology, sometimes what we would do if we're working on things like syntax is that it would be something like, let's say a student is struggling to write a sentence. The adult could just say the sentence and the student you'd say, all right, now it's your turn to say the sentence. And then you would just have them do exactly what you did. So this is a form of scaffolding. And this is one way that you can help students start to get over that hump. So those are some examples, again, to kind of back up to some of those strategies that I mentioned as far as how guided practice can look, which is really the messiest part of this process is that we can, number one, we can ask reflective questions and model reflective questions. So, for example, you could be asking reflective questions to the students that are maybe not exactly giving them the answer, but maybe putting them in the ballpark to kind of nudge them so they have to do a little bit of problem solving on their own. You might be making declarative statements for the same purpose to just kind of direct their attention to the right place in the room, or that might help them to figure out what the next steps are. You might be maybe you are making declarative statements or asking yourself reflective questions just right next to them and modeling how you're asking yourself questions while they're sitting over here so they can see how you would do it. Or one thing that you can do if, let's say that they are struggling, is you can just kind of back up. You can model it for them, and then you can have them go through that same task that you just modeled right then and there. So that's where there can be that fluidity between modeling and guided practice. Sometimes when people think about the modeling phase, they think about, I'm going to do the entire task and the student's going to watch me. But then when you kind of take it over to guided practice, you can be just doing mini models within the context of this, the entire steps of your process. So instead of, if you're doing a writing assignment and you are modeling the whole thing, it might mean you're going to take the notes and then you're going to transfer it over to the graphic organizer, and then you're going to write the paragraph and the student is watching, and you might be modeling how to revise the paragraph. But then when you move over to guided practice, maybe you're allowing the student to practice the note-taking phase, and they're struggling a little bit. So you say, all right, let's back up a little bit. I'm just going to show you how I would do this task. And then you just model that little mini part, and then you let them do it. And then you see if they can do the next step. And maybe they can. Maybe that step right there that you modeled for them helps them get over the hump. So that's where there's some fluidity in this. And again, you can apply this process to really any type of thing that has multiple steps. So one other thing that you can do within the context of the modeling phase or the front-loading phase is that if you have something that is very visual and has a lot of steps, it can be really helpful to create some kind of a visual schedule or some kind of a visual aid that students can refer back to. But what's really important is that you involve students in that process and you pull that visual aid and the creation of that visual aid into your front loading. Because what a lot of people do is they say, oh, the student needs a visual schedule. And then they'll just create the visual schedule on their own and then just kind of plop it in front of the student. And then the student doesn't know what to do with it. But if you involve the student in that planning process, what you're doing is you're modeling executive functioning for them. Because in order for you to figure out what the student needed in their visual schedule, you had to visualize the steps and think about what the student might be doing and think about where they might get stuck. And so that's executive functioning. You want the student to be doing that. So what you can do when you are creating some kind of a visual schedule is involve the student in that process. And then you're talking through all of that with the student. Let's think about what the steps are. Let's, visualize what they might be. Where might you get stuck? And where might we want to put another step in that process so that they can take that and use it as a tool for whatever it is that they're doing inside their classroom, or something that they can use that's going to be a memory strategy for them. And then, again, they can try it and then you can debrief. Then you can talk about it after and say, hey, do we miss any steps? Do we need to add anything to this schedule? And so they can be part of the process in that way. So it's really important that if you are going to use something like that in your, as a strategy for your students, that they are involved in that process and they were actively thinking about what they needed in that strategy. Because if they're not, then the chances of them using it are not very large. Now, do some students not want to use strategies because of whatever reason? Maybe because they are, again, they really don't want to do the task and they're just kind of digging their heels in. Yes. Obviously, we don't want to force them to use any strategy. We wanted to say like, hey, this is something that's going to give you more time to do X, Y, Z, or something that they like to do later. And there is a little bit of a natural consequence to them using the tools that we give them. It's always their choice as to whether or not we use the tools, as to whether or not they want to use their self-talk, in their heads. But this is definitely something that that we have that we want to offer to students. So to go to the question of what do we do in the classroom and how does this look? And I think it's one thing in the therapy room when you've got a small group of kids and you don't have to necessarily get through this writing assignment. You're just doing this writing assignment to help the teacher, to help the student to get some skills that they can apply to the classroom. But I know that sometimes teachers feel a little bit differently about this because they've got the curriculum they've got to get through and all those types of things. And I think that this can be really challenging for students and for the teachers. And so when teachers say things like, well, I can't necessarily sit there with him and give him this support. I can't, if a student needs me to sit next to him in order for him to complete the writing assignment, that's really challenging to do if I've got a classroom full of, 25, 30 students. So there's a couple different things going on here. So it could either mean that that student is lacking the support that they need in order to access their curriculum. So that is one possibility. The possibility does exist that maybe that student needs something that the teacher is having a difficult time providing due to their capacity. And maybe we do need to figure out how to carve out time for the student to get something else that is more individualized attention in order for them to make progress and be able to fully participate in their curriculum. So that is one possibility. And that could look like, maybe the student just needs a little bit more of a nudge to get out that visual schedule, a little bit more strategic modeling to be watching the time or to be think just like some other declarative language and reflective statements that a staff member could be giving them in order to kind of nudge them in the right direction of what can you be thinking about? What can you be doing to prepare yourself right now for whatever it is that we're doing? So those are all good things that you can do in the classroom to give students some supports. And it is possible that if a student is struggling, that they're not getting those things, and that's why they're not following along in class. So that is one possibility. And if that's the case, then what we want to work on with the teachers, with the special service providers, and really any resources that we have available is we want to make sure that we carve out support for those students in order to make sure that they get that modeling, those gentle reminders to use those visual cues. Maybe they do need some additional accommodations and need to sit near the front of the room, or maybe need to sit in a place that's quieter, or maybe have a little bit of extra time. All of that is possible. And yes, another accommodation that we want to think about is, do we want to adjust the amount of work that a student has to do because it takes them longer to complete things? So all possibilities of things that may be relevant for a student to do if they're struggling in the classroom. Where we want to be careful is that we want to make sure that we're not going too far in the other direction. And when I hear teachers say things like, well, I can't sit there with him the whole time, that's definitely not what teachers should be doing in a lot of the cases. What they should be doing is giving those gentle reminders and those nudges, but ultimately students should also be allowed to again, apply those skills and make choices. So if a student is requiring that constant prompting, that might not necessarily be something that would be in the student's best interest for a teaching assistant or a teacher to provide. Again, going back to the scenario that I was giving before, where what if a student is sitting there and they don't necessarily want to do their work? Well, we need to make sure that we create the space and the supports, give the scaffolding, meaning the modeling of self-talk, the reminders to watch the clock, the access to the visual schedules, the reflective statements, and the declarative statements that we can use to kind of nudge students in the right direction. And again, creating it in an environment that's not distracting and all of those things. So we're creating this ecosystem where a student is, we're increasing the student's chances of success. What we're not doing is forcing them or insisting that they do X, Y, Z in a certain amount of time, because it might take longer for the student to do those skills. And maybe it doesn't even make sense for the student to do whatever the task is. Maybe the process of getting ready and going through maybe some discomfort of having to do a task that they don't want to do, get their things ready. Maybe they don't get through the assignment. The not getting through the assignment might be the learning opportunity that that student needs to eventually be able to fully participate in that classroom activity. So there might be a consequence. So maybe the student doesn't finish the assignment and they've got to do it later. So that is something that's possible. And again, we can kind of, as I gave the example before, we have to consider, do we give the student too much work that was beyond what they're able to do? Were they just choosing to not do the work because it was a task that they don't prefer? And maybe we give them some modeling, but then we allow them to do it. And so, we want to be aware of those types of things. But again, we're not insisting or forcing students to do X, Y, Z. What we want to do is make sure that we're giving the opportunity to build the skills. So kind of going back to what I was saying before, if we're thinking about a writing assignment, yes, we eventually want students to be able to do the writing. We want them to practice taking notes and practice reading and practice using the graphic organizers and the planning behind the writing and the revising and all of the things. But what we don't want to do is, if the student is going through that process and maybe they don't get to the end of the writing assignment in the allotted time, we don't want to jump in and prompt them so much because we're so worried about this deadline, about this writing assignment, that we don't give them the opportunity to go through the process. So I always say that when teachers are like, but I can't sit there with them the whole time. Maybe you don't need to. Maybe you do need to do a little bit more for that student to nudge them in the right direction. But maybe it's actually better for the student to sit there and try to do it on their own. So we've got to be really mindful of that with classrooms. And I would say the same thing for parents in the home setting as well. It does get a little tricky with allowing students to fail. I know that can be challenging. We might see some behaviors there, but sometimes allowing students to fail or go through the discomfort is what they need in order for them to have that learning experience. We want to make sure that we're not saving them from those learning experiences. So that's how we want to think about it. One final thing I wanted to mention before I wrap up is that I have gotten questions. So this is, if you are somebody who is working in the schools and you're supporting parents and you have students who are maybe it's not completing assignments, not coming to school, or they're struggling with some of those independent tasks. Maybe they don't know how to get their bag ready and all their things together. So some of those basic functional things as well. And I did get some questions about, how do I support parents? How do I support students who are not having adequate time to socialize because they're not coming to school? This is where it gets really tricky because there's unfortunately, sometimes I've seen finger pointing going on where it's, well, the school should be doing X, Y, Z. And then schools are saying, well, the parents should be doing X, Y, Z. Both people have a responsibility here. So in a situation, let's say, for example, you have a child who does struggle with executive functioning. Maybe it's presenting academically. Maybe it's also presenting functionally, where the parents are having a difficult time getting the kids out the door in the morning. So this is where it is really important to use some of those. If you have the opportunity to be able to collaborate with parents, yes, ultimately what parents do in their home environment is their choice, but we can certainly coach and encourage and give them the as much support and information as they need. Obviously, we are sometimes at the mercy of whatever they choose when we have students who are in the schools, and we certainly want to make the most of the time we have with students, but it would be remiss for me to say that what happens at home isn't going to impact the student in the school. So I would say that if you have a parent who is, let's say that they're having a hard time getting their child out the door in the morning, and as a result, they're constantly prompting them, they're packing their bag for them, they're packing their lunch for them. And if the student forgets their laptop or their assignment or whatever, and the parent is packing it for them, or their gym clothes or whatever it is, then that student is going to be prompt dependent. That what those things that the parent is doing are going to inhibit the child's ability to build those executive functioning skills. If that is the situation that you're in, one of the most powerful things that you can do for a parent in that situation is help them to make that mindset shift that they need to make in order to stop saving their child from discomfort. And I've had a lot of, people say, they're like, what strategy should I teach parents? What homework should I give them? Well, if the parent is not willing to let the child experience discomfort, any strategy that you're going to give them is not going to be helpful, or is not going to be as helpful. So if you have a situation like that, what you can do is you can teach the parent some information. I have the time tracking journal that I give in the School of Clinical Leadership that I also offer as a standalone product, which gives a strategy for that planning and preparing that the parents can absolutely use. If you learn the strategy in your therapy sessions, you can coach the parents to do that. So that is one tool that you can use. But in order for that tool to be effective, the parents have to be able to eventually, maybe they're modeling, they're going to show their student how to, or their child how to make breakfast or pack their bag or whatever it is. But they have to be willing to, once they've modeled, step back and allow the child to do it on their own. And yes, they might be, as I said before, maybe jumping in a little bit with some declarative statements and things like that. But ultimately, they have to be able to rein themselves in and not prompt and save students. And at some point, they need to just say, you know what, it's time to go to school. And I'm sorry that, you didn't get your backpack packed. And they've got to be willing to send their child to school without their things and experience the consequence of those types of whatever choices they made. And again, obviously, we want to be mindful of can't versus won't, but many times kids get used to their parents prompting them, and they do, in order for them to be motivated to change those behaviors, they have to experience the consequences of not necessarily doing XYZ or not necessarily getting started on time, which is what parents are commonly dealing with if students don't want to get moving in the morning. And so kids, a lot of times, in order for them to be motivated to change that behavior, whoever is involved has to stop saving them from discomfort. Same things. One other scenario that people have asked me about is, what if students aren't coming to school, and they're not coming to school because maybe they're staying up really late because they have access to their phone or they're gaming and they're not going to bed on time. So, and those types of situations, again, one of the most powerful mindset shifts that we can help parents to make, because that's definitely something that is very difficult to control if you are in a school and kids aren't coming to school. One of the most powerful mindset shifts that you can help parents make is to set limitations around access to games and screens. If students don't have access to screens and games, then they're going to be less likely to stay up all night and not go to bed and then not want to come to school. So being able to set those limits for kids can be really powerful. And a lot of times, some of the big behaviors that parents are seeing go away when we remove some of those things that tend to be overstimulating and causing some of those behaviors. So really common things would be things like gaming and screens and things that are addictive and hard to put down. because a lot of times parents are having a difficult time getting their child out the door in the morning because they didn't sleep, because they were on the device too long. And so that can make a really big difference on the parents' ability to provide that scaffolding in the home so that they're able to show up to school rested and ready for school. One final thing that I wanted to clarify that is a kind of a common question is just the idea of reward and punishment and positive reinforcement and consequences. So a really important shift to make when we're talking about some of these tasks that are less stimulating, less preferred, is that in order for kids to be able to tolerate tasks that are hard or not immediately stimulating, is that they need to have boundaries around when they get access. And if they get access to some of those things that do tend to be more addictive, like screens. So in situations like that, the way that we frame those screens and those just any preferred activity has to change. Instead of saying, you're going to lose XYZ if you don't do X, we can frame it the other way around. So rather than them assuming that this is something that I am entitled to, we say, you know what, in order for you to be able to, watch TV or whatever it is that they want to do, we have to get our work done before we get to do our extra fun type of things. That is just life. Like in life, if you don't go to work and pay your bills and get all your work done, then, we have less time to Netflix and chill or whatever it is that we want to do. So that is a normal thing in life. If you want to be able to pay for things and have time to do things that are fun, we have to be able to delay gratification. So instead of thinking of, I'm entitled to all of these things, we have to think about, well, these are my responsibilities and my obligations and things that I have to do so that I can earn these other things. That's just kind of a natural way that the world works. So we want to frame it that way when we're thinking about all of these different things that kids have access to and trying to create some structure around natural consequences or things that aren't necessarily completely natural, but we might have some control over. Because again, if kids always get access to things that maybe adults are paying for and they're seen as entitlements, well, then it's going to be very difficult for them to learn the skill of delaying gratification as adults. So you want to shift that to, here's this thing that you're entitled to and I'm taking it away, versus here are your things that are your responsibilities. And if you complete your responsibilities, then we might be able to do X, Y, Z, and we might have time to do this other thing that you want to do. So these are your responsibilities and these are these extra things that might be privileges that you have, versus this is a thing that you're entitled to and I'm going to take it away if you don't do this thing that I want you to do. Because then we start to get into some control issues, and then there can be issues with entitlement and all kinds of things. So we want to frame it the other way, because then it's really about teaching kids to delay gratification. So we've covered a lot today. These are some common questions that I wanted to address because they've come up in the program as well as on the webinar. So I will link to the time tracking journal for those of you that are just interested in taking a look at that product. Again, that's something that I sell as a standalone product that does come with the School of Clinical Leadership. I will also share the link to my previous episode where I talk about the paradigm shifts for the school teams, where I talk about things like priming and real life practice and some examples of how you might prime and front load for more of a social situation. And I will also link to the School of Clinical Leadership, which is my program that really helps give the whole framework. So I help you to have some tools that you can use when you're front loading and preparing students for situations. But then I also give you the tools that you need to create a strategic plan so that you know how to take what you're doing in therapy and train other people. Because as I I hope that I have emphasized today, it's really important for this to be a team process. So a couple places that you can go, again, to get more information about the time tracking journal, go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/time journal. And for the School of Clinical Leadership, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. So yeah, thanks so much, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all the resources that were mentioned in this episode. And be sure to check out the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers put executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams using multiple service delivery models. So I show you how to do direct intervention, and I also show you how to coach and train others so that you can ensure students get support across their day. Remember that it helps me so much if you tell your friends and colleagues about De Facto Leaders, and if you follow me and leave me a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts, whether you listen on Apple or Spotify or another podcast network. And finally, if you're interested in collaborating with me, if you'd like to invite me to be on your podcast, if you would like to be a guest on De Facto Leaders, or if you have a suggestion for a guest for De Facto Leaders, please email me at talktome@drkarenspeech.com. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.